Good morning, everyone, or depending on from where around the world that you're dialing in from, good afternoon and good evening. I would first like to thank the U.S. Energy Association Program and USAID for coordinating this valuable effort, and I hope that all those tuning into this workshop today find the topics covered useful and continue to keep safe and healthy during these uncertain times. My name is Ramon Wangdi, and I head up Excelerate Energy's business development activities for the Asia-Pacific region. And for today's presentation, I'll be covering a case study of Excelerate's Metocean floating LNG project, which was delivered in 2018 as Bangladesh's first LNG import terminal. First, an introduction to Excelerate for those who aren't as familiar with our company. Excelerate is the industry leader in providing integrated floating LNG import solutions to new markets around the globe. We own and operate the largest fleet of floating storage and regasification units, or FSRUs for short, and we utilize this fleet of vessels to provide flexible, reliable, and rapid energy solutions to our customers worldwide. To date, we have developed and operated at 13 of the 24 total FSRU-based LNG import terminals in the world, and having pioneered the technology through the delivery of our first FSRU in 2005, we have over 40 years of regas days and over 1,800 LNG cargoes delivered under our belt through an operational process known as ship-to-ship transfer, or STS. Headquartered in the Woodlands, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston, we are the only U.S. company in the floating regas sector and have projects spanning a wide array of markets from right here in the United States, off the coast of Massachusetts Bay with our Northeast Gateway facility, to Brazil and Argentina and Latin America, to Israel and United Arab Emirates in the Middle East. And here in Asia Pacific, we delivered Pakistan's first LNG import terminal in 2015, and most recently delivered Bangladesh's 2 LNG terminals in 2018 and 2019, respectively. Now, in addition to the chartering of FSRUs, Excelerate brings a broad range of experience and solutions to the projects that it develops. This ranges from leading the design, engineering, and construction of any fixed infrastructure required for the terminal to commissioning and operating the entire terminal, both FSRU and infrastructure, on an integrated basis. We also provide LNG supply solutions where necessary, and also implement our projects through local regional business units, which allows us to operate our terminals under a partnership model more locally, whether that means interfacing and complying with local regulators, working with labor unions, or conducting various stakeholder engagements. This localized partnership model and approach to project development has been especially valuable to our customers who are new to LNG, which is often the case with emerging markets, as it makes the transition to introducing a new fuel into a country's energy system a far smoother process. Now, before diving deeper into Bangladesh's energy markets and the MLNG project itself, I want to first provide a quick snapshot as to where we stand today in Bangladesh and on its LNG journey, and the tremendous achievements that our partners in the government have made in this first 2 years of LNG imports. So in August of 2018, some 2 years after entering into commercial agreements, the Mahashkali Floating LNG, or MLNG project for short, was brought online with the delivery of its maiden cargo from Qatar, and Bangladesh became the 40th country to join the LNG Importers Club. Some highlights from this first 2 years include the bringing online of a second FSRU terminal, the 7 LNG project, which also utilizes one of Excelerate's FSRUs, which was brought online in May 2019, thereby doubling the country's import capacity to a total of 1 billion cubic feet per day. The successful delivery of over 100 LNG cargoes, an equivalent volume of 7 million tons of LNG, sourced from 10 different countries, and deliver on board a fleet of over 35 LNG tankers. In fact, the most recent deliveries into Bangladesh have been made on board what are known as, in our industry, as Q-Flex vessels, which are basically some of the largest vessels in the world, and really is a testament to how quickly the country has overcome some of its early technical challenges and is a ringing endorsement from the global oil and gas industry that the Bangladeshi market is now truly open for trade. However, more important than all these achievements within the LNG space is the fact that Petrobangla has been able to deliver over 300 million MMBTU of natural gas to its customers in the port city of Chattogram, which is the second largest city in Bangladesh after Dhaka. Not only does this represent a 20% supply uplift over the country's total gas supply, it also creates an enormous economic boost for the region, with several power plants, fertilizer factories, and industrial facilities that had previously laid dormant having now resumed operations and in fact reaching peak production levels. Looking ahead, LNG projects such as MLNG and Summit LNG or SLNG have also created several direct and indirect job opportunities, and we fully expect for this trend to continue throughout the year as Petrobangla completes its transmission system, its pipeline system downstream of our facilities to allow for imports from existing terminals to reach its full capacity of 7.5 million tons per annum. Bangladesh began exploring LNG as an energy source several years before entering into agreements for MLNG. In fact, it began, I think, as early as 2012, so about 5 years before agreements were signed for MLNG in 2016. And at the time, Bangladesh shared a lot of the same characteristics of emerging market economies who were looking to do the same. So by definition, emerging markets are developing countries that are characterized by their rapidly growing economies and demand for energy, especially as it relates to power generation. Now, these markets often lack the physical and institutional infrastructure to access a reliable source of clean energy, such as LNG. As a result, the energy sector in these countries are quite often heavily regulated and ran by large state-owned enterprises that have to follow very strict and rigid procurement policies and guidelines for the approval and implementation of large energy projects. So a reoccurring theme that we face in many of these emerging market countries is that there's a political sensitivity for projects which appear to increase the dependency on fuel imports. And this is driven due to the perceived impact that these projects have on increasing a country's dependency on foreign resources versus focusing its efforts on exploiting domestic ones. So Excelerate's experience in developing LNG terminals for several years now has been quite the contrary to this perception. We strongly believe that the development of necessary infrastructure to import gas allows industries downstream of our facilities to flourish as it provides supply certainty. And this increased demand in turn allows increased exploration and production activity, which eventually leads to greater domestic production as a result. In other words, over the long run, the LNG imported through FSRUs supplements a country's goal towards energy independence and not the other way around. And it's something that we believe is, over the long run, quite a key factor to take into account as emerging economies such as Bangladesh look to expand their LNG program. As mentioned in the previous slide, one of the fundamental drivers behind LNG projects in emerging markets like Bangladesh typically comes from increased needs for LNG-based power generation. With this in mind, the following two slides look at two possible structures that governments may evaluate and consider when planning and expanding their LNG to power programs while utilizing FSRU-based technology. First, under a traditional time charter party model, the independent power producer, or IPP, would establish a terminal company, which is shown here in green, to procure regas capacity. This company would in turn need to procure each component of the project separately under a variety of different contracts. First, you would need a charter party or TCP for the FSRU. You would need an EPC for the terminal infrastructure, a port service agreement for tugs and other support craft, a separate EPC and O&M agreement for the power plant itself, And finally, a sale and purchase agreement for the LNG and power purchase agreement for the sale and purchase of electricity with the local power distributor. All this needs to be structured in such a way while taking into account the requirements of various different stakeholders, regulators, and different lending groups across each component of the project's assets. So as you can see, this is quite a complex structure to implement, and has often been one of the key factors as to why these programs oftentimes fail in a variety of different scenarios and markets. Under a more integrated model, as shown in this slide here, one company would provide all the regas terminal services under a single contract known as a terminal use agreement, or TUA. And this company's scope would be to implement all the necessary marine components of the project and exclude all onshore or fuel and power components of the project, thereby more appropriately aligning the responsibility with the respective company's experience and expertise. The number of contracts under an integrated model versus the TCP model that I just showed on the previous slide is significantly reduced to essentially three: a TUA for terminal capacity between the terminal company and the off-taker, a sale and purchase agreement with the LNG supplier for the sale and purchase of LNG, and finally a PPA with for the sale of power. By dividing the project assets within this gas to power chain into its offshore components, that being the terminal, and its onshore components, that being the power plant, and its fuel components, and that being the SPA for fuel supply with the LNG supplier, it allows the project to maximize the synergies available between the offshore and onshore markets. The ultimate benefit from this approach is that it drastically reduces the complexity in the execution and implementation of the project through the construction and into its operations. And as we kind of go into the details between how MLNG was implemented, and I think one of the reasons behind why the Bangladeshi government was able to successfully expand its program in the way that it did, I think that the integrated model, which is what Petrobangla and Bangladesh implemented, was one of the key reasons behind that success. So with the backdrop of the industry in mind, we can begin to analyze the Bangladeshi economy to better understand the factors which help lead to the realization of MLNG. Located in South Asia, Bangladesh is a country that's bordered by the states of West Bengal in India to the west, the seven sister states of India to the northeast, and Myanmar to the southeast. Basically, Bangladesh is a country that's surrounded by other nations that are either net importers of natural gas, in the case of India, or in the case of Myanmar, a country that produces a significant amount of its own gas but consumes most of it domestically, as that country goes through its own period of rapid industrialization and economic growth. Another important feature of Bangladesh to understand is that it is the largest, most densely populated river delta in the world, with a population of over 160 million people. And the only coastal access in the country is via the Bay of Bengal, making the country especially vulnerable to the environmental impacts of climate change. In fact, the United Nations consistently ranks Bangladesh in the top 10 countries for being the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Therefore, the sensitivity of the Bangladeshi population towards environmental issues such as the effects of carbon emissions on clean air and the effects of climate change are very real issues for Bangladesh, and therefore Bangladesh is consistently taking a leadership role in the global stage as it relates to these issues. Finally, Bangladesh has an extremely robust economy. It's in fact the fifth fastest growing economy in the world, with over 5% GDP growth or above in the last 20 years. And it's been able to achieve this feat by being an export-driven economy anchored by especially the ready-made garment industry. And this export-driven feature has allowed Bangladesh to maintain a very healthy foreign exchange reserve base of US dollars, which has bodes well for capital-intensive sectors such as LNG projects and also for fuel imports. And that's something that a lot of countries that don't have these features are not able to benefit from. And so it basically allows Bangladesh to have a more sustainable model towards implementing fuel import strategies, because basically the fuel from these imports are funding industries that are in turn generating more US dollars, and therefore it's a very circular and sustainable process. On this slide, we take a closer look at the Bangladeshi energy market as it stands today, and the government's plan for the future on expanding its energy program to keep pace with economic growth. So recently, Bangladesh's energy system has generally been marked by two key features. One, it's been heavily dependent on natural gas, as about 2/3 of the country's energy system depends on natural gas as a primary fuel source. Second, rapid growth, as Bangladesh has more than quadrupled its installed power capacity from 4.5 gigawatts in 2009 to about 20 gigawatts by 2020, and more than doubling the electrification rate, that is the percentage of the population that has access to electricity, from 45% to about 95% in that same time period. Looking ahead, the government plans to aggressively expand its installed power capacity threefold, from, as I mentioned, 20 gigawatts today to about 60 gigawatts by 2041. And the primary way that the government is looking to achieve this is via an enormous expansion of the country's fleet of coal-based power plants. Today, coal makes up less than 2% of the country's overall power mix, and this number is expected to expand enormously from 2% today to about 40% in the next 15 years. Now, even though with that being said, the country's plans for expanding its coal program faces significant challenges. First of all, economic. Bangladesh does not produce its own coal resources. Therefore, the cost of importing coal from places like China, Indonesia, or Australia just makes the general cost of imported coal more expensive than it would be if the country had its own domestic resources. And this is further compounded by the fact that Bangladesh has some very natural, challenging environmental features, such as adverse weather with the monsoon seasons, a shallow coastline, and this complicates the supply chain for delivered coal into the country, which further adds to the cost of that delivered coal. Secondly, coal projects around the world today are going to be quite challenged in terms of access to capital, because the private sector essentially are not funding new coal-based power projects anymore. And typically new power projects in the coal space are being financed nowadays by state-backed programs, such as state financing from the Chinese government and the likes. And finally, as I was mentioning earlier, that Bangladesh has historically taken a leadership role on the global stage on issues of climate change. So there is a geopolitical sensitivity as well, as it relates to the country looking to aggressively expand its coal-based power program, while at the same time making good on its international commitments to taking action on climate change. And next, focusing a little bit deeper into the gas industry. As I was mentioning, historically, Bangladesh has had an abundant supply of its own indigenous domestic gas resources, with fields such as Bibiana and Titus in the northeastern part of the country. And the country today currently produces about 2,500 million standard cubic feet per day of gas from these domestic resources. Today, as of today, the country generally has about 12 trillion cubic feet of natural gas left in its domestic resources. And at the current production levels, the expectation is for these domestic resources to be completely depleted over the next 10 to 15 years. Now, LNG was introduced in the country in 2018, and all the terminals that were brought online and that are being planned for the future are currently centered around the southeastern part of the nation. So, what that leaves is basically an entire part of the country in terms of the western and southern parts of Bangladesh that don't have reliable access to natural gas supply. And even though that these parts of the country are connected to the nation's gas grid, given its proximity to supply sources and other capacity constraints, there's an expectation that there will be continuous supply deficits in the western and southern parts of the country. And therefore, we expect that the next phase of investment in the LNG and in gas supply investment will be taking place to make sure that these parts of the country are able to keep pace with the economic growth that takes, and industrial growth that is being witnessed in other regions of southeastern, northeastern, and central Bangladesh. Now, as mentioned in my previous slide, Bangladesh has historically had a very large and healthy domestic reserve base of natural gas. However, as seen in this slide, this reserve base is rapidly declining, and unless the country is able to successfully expand its domestic reserves through enormous investment in the upstream sector, it will continue to face a significant supply deficit in terms of meeting natural gas demand going forward. As seen from the following graphs, which were taken from the government's gas sector master plan, assuming a moderate amount of exploration success, a substantial portion of the supply shortfall of almost 6 billion cubic feet per day will need to be met via gas imports, which is primarily going to be made up of LNG due to the factors I was mentioning before about Bangladesh being surrounded by countries that are net importers of natural gas. With existing facilities only being able to make up about 1 billion cubic feet per day of that shortfall, enormous investment will continue to need to be made across the LNG and gas value chain, all the way from LNG terminals to pipelines to power plants. And that investment is going to be needed over the next 10, 15, 20 years in order for Bangladesh to keep up pace with demand and for the country to continue its very impressive economic growth that it's had in the previous 10 years. Now, with this understanding of the Bangladeshi economy and energy market, I'll spend the remainder of my presentation today covering the MLNG project in more detail. As I mentioned before, the commercial agreements for MLNG were executed in July of 2016, and the terminal was brought online a little over 2 years later in August of 2018. However, the groundwork which allowed for MLNG to become a reality was laid several years earlier, both in and outside of Bangladesh. And that's because at the time, MLNG represented many firsts for Bangladesh and the broader LNG industry. Not only was it the first LNG import terminal in the Bay of Bengal, which had some of the most challenging natural operating conditions in the world, but also was the first fully integrated turnkey FSRU-based terminal in the industry where all components were consolidated under a single terminal use contract with the country's national oil company, Petrobangla. Finally, from a technical standpoint, MLNG was truly a first of its kind, as it represented the first offshore FSRU that was moored utilizing a single-point submerged turret buoy system, where deliveries were taking place while the FSRU was moored onto the buoy. This slide shows the location of the FSRU, which is located approximately 5 kilometers off the coast of Mahashkali Island. The project scope included the FSRU itself, all marine infrastructure, which includes the submerged turret mooring system, the anchors, the plem, umbilicals, and about 7 kilometers of subsea pipeline, and also a dedicated fleet of port service vessels, such as tugs and fast crew boats. In addition to the technical characteristics of the terminal, one important element that was part of Excelerate's scope and is often overlooked in LNG projects is the responsibility to obtain necessary permits and government approvals for the terminal. This is quite often challenging, especially for new LNG markets, as we have to work alongside the various regulators from the Departments of Environment, Energy, Shipping, to tax authorities, to the central banks, in order to be able to create a regulatory framework that is established in such a way which facilitates the necessary investments in the project to take place. Now, one of the big advantages that Bangladesh had was that it had a very robust and successful IPP framework within the power sector for garnering private investment in the power industry. And a lot of the elements from that space was taken into account whenever we worked with the Bangladeshi government to formulate a regulatory practice that could basically allow for projects such as MLNG and future LNG projects to take place. Now this slide has an image which illustrates the LNG value chain extending both upstream and downstream of MLNG. So the LNG cargo is sourced from the international markets and shipped to the terminal on board an LNG tanker. Here you see one arriving at the terminal and one already alongside the FSRU. And from there, the FSRU receives the LNG cargo via a process known as ship-to-ship transfer, where the liquid LNG is unloaded onto the FSRU. From there, the FSRU gasifies the LNG and delivers high-pressure natural gas to Petrobangla's 90-kilometer onshore gas transmission pipeline, from where it is delivered to the Chattogram Citygate system for distribution to end users. Next, we have an animation that Excelerate prepared early on in the construction of MLNG. And it was actually prepared not for presentations such as this, but for the LNG supply, the operators of the tankers of the LNG suppliers. As I mentioned, there's been over 35 independent tankers that have made call-ins to MLNG thus far. And from a terminal compatibility standpoint, it's very important for these, the operators of these vessels to get very comfortable as to the unique nature of this type of offshore operation. So here you see a bird's eye view of the terminal. And the animation zooms in from the view of the oncoming LNG tanker as it arrives on a given regas day. So the tanker makes anchorage just outside the port limits. It meets the pilot boarding vessel at the pilot boarding station, where pilots are transferred onto the LNG tanker for maneuvering. From that point, the LNG tanker is met by the fleet of port service vessels that were under the scope of Excelerate's operations. And the 3 tugboats escort the LNG tanker to maneuver her And this entire operation that you see from the point that the vessel arrives at the pilot boarding station to the moment that she's all fast alongside the FSRU, which she's doing just now, that entire process takes about 12 to 16 hours on any given day, given depending on the weather conditions for that delivery day. And here you see the vessels alongside each other. They're moored safely alongside. Hoses are being transferred and the unloading process begins. So here you see a full cargo of LNG on board the LNG tanker, and she's unloading that LNG to the FSRU into her containment tanks. And as this is going on, the FSRU is able to regasify LNG into natural gas, as you can see that's taking place here. And that process of unloading LNG and regasifying LNG into natural gas can happen concurrently. And here you see the natural gas being delivered via the submerged turret loading system at the front of the FSRU, where she's regasified and delivered onshore to the transmission system that takes her to end users in Chittagong. And that entire operation is from the moment that the vessel arrives at the port limits to unloading of the complete cargo is about 48 hours, depending on the size of the LNG tanker. And that's the exact operation that Excelerate's done now in Bangladesh about 100 times over. And it's become something that has become quite standard, but was really a first of its kind whenever we did it back in September of 2018. So next, a little bit about the project structure. As I mentioned in previous slides, Petrobangla decided early on in its planning that it wanted to simplify the implementation of its LNG program by integrating all the terminal components into a single interface. Therefore, the government of Bangladesh only had 2 contracts for the project, a TUA for terminal services and an implementation agreement, or IA, for governing all the permits and government approvals necessary to construct and operate the facility. And even though these are the only two agreements that the government saw, there was in fact a multitude of subcontracts which Excelerate had to arrange in the background in order to be able to execute the project. Now, from an investment standpoint, Excelerate brought in the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group, as a partner on the terminal and raised debt with a club of different development finance institutions, which in addition to the IFC included DFIs from Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. One element which made the structure of the project more unique was that the FSRU itself was chartered into the project company under a time charter party, and therefore did not form a part of the security package for the lenders to MLNG. And this structure was considered quite unique and innovative from a project finance perspective. Now, as I was alluding to earlier, there are certain characteristics which exist for MLNG operating in the middle of the Bay of Bengal, which makes it quite uniquely challenging to operate facilities of this nature. And that primarily is because of the weather conditions that exist in that part of the world. The Bay of Bengal basically has two monsoon seasons which take place across the year, and the more adverse of which is the southwest monsoon season that takes place over the summer period. And not only are you having to deal with cyclonic conditions, there are generally quite aggressive sea states that take place during that time of the year. And very early on in our due diligence of the Bangladeshi market, this was the primary headwind that we were facing in evaluating whether it was viable to have an FSRU-based or an LNG terminal period for this country and for this market. And so as we do with most of our projects, one of the first studies that we conduct is a detailed Metocean and availability analysis. And I'm not going to go into too much details as it gets quite complex, quite technical, but I thought I'd spend the next few slides going over what made some of these characteristics quite challenging at the early phases of developing this project, and how we ultimately overcame those challenges by designing around these unique characteristics in order to be able to mitigate that risk. So whenever you operate FSRU or LNG terminals, there are basically 4 weather conditions or Metocean conditions that you have to take into account. You have to take into account wind speeds, you have to take into account swell, you have to take into account wave heights, and you have to take into account currents. And each of those features is important, but it's how they operate in unison that ultimately decides whether you have the ability to have a terminal that has a high amount of availability for both ship-to-ship transfer operations and also regas operations. And one of the unique features of the Bangladeshi operating environment was that the predominant swell in the region primarily came from a northeasterly direction. And that's what you see here in this rose plot diagram. What you see on the right-hand side is that the swell throughout the year comes almost entirely from a northeasterly direction, which was a characteristic that allowed us to basically design our FSRU to be facing in the direction of the swell, thereby increasing the availability pocket of the terminal. So as I mentioned, the entire strategy from a technical standpoint was to have the FSRU moored into an STL buoy. And what typically in facilities of this nature, what you have is the FSRU, what you call weather vaning or rotating alongside that buoy. What you had in Bangladesh was a very northeasterly unidirectional swell, and you really wanted to have the FSRU facing in the direction of that swell in order to minimize the loads that were being created on the mooring lines across the stern anchors and everything along the different parts of the infrastructure chain. And therefore, one design element that we added to our system was to have anchors at the stern of the vessel. Here you can see it denoted by anchors 10, 12, 11, and 9, which basically kept the vessel pointed in the direction of the swell. And as you can see from this next slide, what we call this in our industry is to maintain a fixed heading. So the FSRU is always maintaining a heading of about 200 degrees. And there are various calculations and different studies that our technical team has to conduct. But essentially what we found through our studies was that if you're able to maintain the vessel into a direction of going about 200 degrees, then you could increase the availability pocket for ship-to-ship transfer operations, which is really the more sensitive of the two when you compare regas operations and ship-to-ship transfer operations. And so the entire design of the facility was centered around this, primary mindset of having the FSRU constantly facing in the direction of the swell in order to minimize the loads placed onto the system, and in order to therefore maximize the availability of the overall terminal operations. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, to date that system has worked wonderfully well, because I think that over 2 years and two terminals in operations and 100 STS cargoes, we haven't had a single day of unavailability due to adverse weather. And that takes into account, by the way, having gone through 2 cyclones in the last 2 years. We just had cyclone Amphan make landfall in northeastern India and southern Bangladesh just last week, in fact. And we were able to constantly regasify through that operation or through that weather event, and continue providing much needed energy into the system as conditions like that make their way through the region. Finally, an illustration to show the proximity of the second FSRU that was brought online in May of 2019, the SLNG terminal. And as you can see here, the 2 terminals basically feed into the same energy grid and are very close to each other, about 4 nautical miles. SLNG is about 4 nautical miles to the northwest of MLNG. And essentially together, they're sister ships, first of all, and together they operate basically as a single terminal, because in both cases, Petrobangla is the ultimate buyer of LNG. And there's a lot of synergies that Petrobangla is able to capture by having 2 FSRUs there at the same time, and basically to be able to operate against each other. So it's something that has worked out quite well for Petrobangla and for the Bangladeshi market. Next, there's a few pictures. I think I've shown quite a few animations and images from the project, but now a little bit as to the reality as to how the project ended up looking. So here you see the subsea pipeline for both MLNG and SLNG. The 2 projects were brought online about a year apart from each other, but a lot of the construction was able to take place simultaneously, which obviously had a tremendous amount of synergies across the 2 facilities. So here you see the subsea pipeline coming onto Mahashkali Island. Here's a picture of the subsea pipeline being laid from an offshore pipe lay barge. A couple images of the 24-inch pipelines being fabricated on that barge. Here you get a little bit of a feel of some of the different components involved in the construction process. On the right-hand side, you have the delivery point of where the MLNG pipeline feeds into the gas transmission system of Petrobangla. And so you have a delivery platform where the facilities are tied in together. And on the left-hand side, what you see is the pipeline end manifold, which basically rests on the seabed and is the conduit from which the natural gas from the FSRU is delivered onto the subsea pipeline and eventually downstream into this delivery platform, which you see on the right-hand side. Here you can see a picture of our heavy lift vessel laying suction anchors for our mooring lines. And I think you can kind of get a scale of the size and magnitude of the type of facilities that we're talking about as it relates to the fixed infrastructure of the terminal. A few more images, again, another picture of the pipeline end manifold, another picture of the suction anchor, which again gives you a much better idea as to the scale of what we're talking about in terms of the suction anchors that are being moored onto the seabed. On the top right-hand side, you see what we call the landing pad for the submerged turret loading system, which rests on the seabed. under an emergency disconnect procedure, the buoy would basically rest on the landing pad, as shown here. Another picture of the STL system being connected to the fixed infrastructure. Another picture from the pipelay barge showing our contractors at work. More pictures of the construction taking place offshore. Now, this picture I find quite interesting because it's an often overlooked element as to the intricacies of the final phases of construction. And whenever you reach the final stages of the construction of the fixed infrastructure, you basically have to align the different components of the terminal and the fixed infrastructure, and you have to have a tremendous amount of diving operations take place. And here you can see one of those diving operations that was taking place during the winter periods. And the reason I think that this picture is interesting is that, as you can see, the visibility, generally speaking, is moderate, but I think manageable. But the same diving operations that were taking place in the middle of the monsoon season, the divers basically had visibility of about 1 foot in front of their face. And the diving operations could only take place a few hours in the day, given the current conditions and the semi-diurnal changing of the currents that took place every 6 hours. And so the overall construction became quite challenging the closer you got to the southwest monsoon season, which begins in about April, May. And our facility was delivered in August. So as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of the final phases of construction had to take place in the middle of the monsoon season. Finally, a few pictures from our operations. I think the pictures on the left-hand side illustrate a more normal operation. And what you see on the right-hand side, first of all, on the picture on the top right-hand side, is some of the neighbors, let's call it, of MLNG. And, basically, the Mahashkali area of Bangladesh is a very rich fishing community. And oftentimes, we have to have support from the Bangladeshi Navy. Of course, our port service vessels also help and support in creating a safety perimeter. But what you see is basically a fishing boat coming very close to our FSRU and an LNG tanker. And you see security vessels basically trying to get the fishing boats to maintain a safe distance from the ongoing operation. On the bottom right-hand side, it's difficult to make out, but when people talk about adverse weather, they're often thinking about cyclones, typhoons, things of that nature. But what they don't often think about is situations like the one that took place on this day, where there was a heavy fog cover that basically prevented any operations from taking place that day due to a lack of visibility. And it's those type of events that, regardless if you're an onshore facility or if you're an offshore FSRU-based facility, events like that are simply going to be a universal reason to not be able to conduct an operation on that given day. So it's something that, having now done this for quite a few years, we've seen and been through it all. So I think that this is just a small example of some of the challenges that are not often thought about. And finally, to end my presentation today, I just want to leave with some conclusions and sort of lasting impacts that we feel both MLNG and just LNG in general has had on the Bangladeshi market and the socioeconomic impact that has had on the country. As I mentioned, there were a significant amount of power plants and fertilizer factories that had previously been dormant. And since we began operations, there are at least 700 megawatts of previously mothballed power plants in Chittagong. There's one by the name of Shakabala and one by the name of Rauzan that had previously laid idle due to the lack of feedstock that had now been brought back online. In addition, several fertilizer factories, such as one by the name of CAFCO that was producing urea, has now resumed production again. And the production of fertilizers is a crucial industry for the Bangladeshi economic engine. And so, facilities like that have been brought back online, and the transmission system that Petrobangla continues to build out will allow the full effects of LNG to reach the far-reaching corners of the country. And so we're excited to be part of that story and to grow with the market. Um, and finally, I think that what I would kind of mention as well is that for all these power plants that are dual fuel and without natural gas as a feedstock, they're going to be running off of diesel or heavy fuel oil. Replacing these liquid fuels with liquefied natural gas as a feedstock has come at a tremendous amount of savings to Bangladesh from this fuel switching. So, even though today oil is at a depressed price, but assuming a more normalized price of $60 per barrel of oil, LNG imports potentially save Bangladesh anywhere between the ballpark of $300 to $800 million a year, depending on the differences in price at that given time. So I think that's been an added, economic impact and savings for the country, which we're happy to be a part of. So with that said, I would conclude my presentation today by just thanking you all for listening in. And I hope that you found our experiences in Bangladesh insightful and constructive. And I again wish you all the best of health and safety. And thank you very much.